Hi everyone, it's Skillshare Fashion Drawing Tutorials, and in this lesson we're going to render this beautiful look from Dries Van Noten Fall 2020 ready-to-wear collection. Here are the tools that we'll need, and I used template from December set of templates that are available for level 3 and higher patrons. You can use any pose. The focus of this tutorial is going to be mostly on velvet, snake texture, and like this accessories. So I'm starting from the base color for this color, which is mint. I added tip on how to draw these ruffles on Patreon, so you can check it out. I'm using pine to show the shadows. Usually for the velvet you'll need at least two colors. One is the base and one for the shadows. So for now we have mint as the base and I'm using pine for the shadows. And you can see that I leave the highlights, the central part of every fold, left light, and on the sides I add shadows. So here the top of the fold I'm going to keep it a bit lighter and adding shadows. Of course the fabric can have some smaller folds, some small depressions, and it's important to consider not to draw it too artificial, so each fold has center lit and the side darker, because especially when the fold is big, you can crease somewhere in the middle as well, a little bit. So now I'm just working with these two markers, mint and pine. And I also try to work a bit faster because if my base layer is still wet, when I add the next layer, it blends a little bit, just like paint and water. I always repeat it, but I just want you to remember it always, because if you just check Instagram or you just talk to someone while coloring, working with markers, the layer can dry and then the next layer will lay absolutely differently. So I'm using now holly for this lower part and then adding cool gray 5. But you can still use pine for the bottom part instead of holly, not to use too many colors, just dark green. And I'm using cool gray 5 to make that dark green even darker on the top of it. So all those grays are good to make certain parts darker. And next I'm using white pencil to add highlights, so we have darker shadows. We just made them with cool gray 5, and I'm adding highlights to make the light parts that are in mint even lighter. So just in the middle of those light spots I'm adding white pencil, also showing these edges of the ruffles, adding an extra cool gray 5. And yeah, so as the base for these golden balls, I'm adding vanilla, because it's a bit orangey, a bit not too saturated yellow. And to add shadows I'm using warm gray 4, and I'm going to leave just this shape like mushroom in the middle. Those will be highlights, so my highlights are a bit bigger on the top and smaller in the bottom, because my bottom part mostly has the shadows. So the light is more concentrated on the top part of these balls. So warm gray 4, and we have cool grays, we have ice grays, and warm grays we use them for warm colors. For now it's yellow, that's why. I'm using black pencil, using a bit longer one, just for the convenience. And I'm showing the shape of the ball with the thin lines and adding thicker lines at the bottom to show the shadows that we have there. And for the quality of the pencils, it's better to use oil pencils or wax pencils, just because they're thicker and you won't need to push hard. In this case, watercolors wouldn't work. So I'm using raw sienna, but you can use gold or anything that has a bit stronger this like dark yellow pigment. So I'm adding it on the sides of that highlights. And because we lost some highlights, I'm adding more with a white pen. You can use 08, 10, really thick nib of white pen, not one that gives really fine lines. We need thicker spots. And around those bigger spots, I'm adding some tiny, like tiny spot, like stripes, little strokes. And next, I'm adding some shadows with a cool gray 5 just under the ruffles on those balls, because there should be some parts that don't get the light because of the ruffles, just below them. I'm adding some shadows. Okay, so here I want to draw this color a bit closer to the center. And I want to darken this bottom part of the color. Okay. Extra shadows just under. Next, I'm going to first add all those shadows on your like jersey sweater. So because anything that is woolen, anything that is like light absorbing fabric, is better to add all those shadows in the beginning. And that's what I'm going to do. Just making the jacket a bit longer, so we don't have the bottom of the sweater and your jacket on the same line, on the same level. It doesn't look really good. So now I'm adding all the shadows first. Why I do it? Because when I add the main layer, all those now I'm adding shadows with a cool gray 5 under the balls, because when I add the full layer and cool gray 5 for dark shadows on the sweater as well, those shadows will be a bit they will be more subtle, less prominent, and it's really important for light absorbing fabrics. So now I'm when I'm coloring everything, those shadows will not be, you know, too striking, too strong. And it's important for like something woolen. So while it's still wet, I can still add shadows that are like a bit blended, a bit blurred. So I'm adding extra shadows everywhere where I feel like I'm having too weak spots, like they're too light. I'm adding extra. So you can see I have here some shadows just above your breasts, because there is the fabric goes a little bit just between your breasts, and just some stretching in the middle, diagonal stretching. And the top of your breast is kept without shadows because it gets more light. So yeah, here we can even add some highlights. And we can add highlights just on any folds that we have, just between the shadows. Usually there is a relationship, like if you have some deep shadows, there should be some, just next to it should be some strong highlights. In our case, strong is just a bit of white pencil, just a little bit, because it's not a PVC, it's not silk. Add some shadows with ice gray 4 just along the jacket, and you can make some shadows a bit darker using black pencil. Be very careful, limit yourself. Stronger contrast, but not too much. Adding extra shadows on the bottom part of those balls. Okay. And this hem part. So here on your left side, I added a baby pink, but I didn't include this mark into the tool list because you can actually color everything with burgundy and just ignore this part with the pink. But since first I draw and then I comment, you still see this. Then I'm using slate to add shadows. So basically you could color everything with burgundy and just add slate, but you can also follow me and do it with pink, because we'll work in one way with one side and in more simple but still nice way on the right side. So just you can try both. So why I used baby pink? Because I wanted to use for like super light parts. I still do it when I work with velvet, certain types of velvet, when there are some strong highlights, like when it's let's say some violet, dark violet velvet, and it has highlights that are like lilac or lavender. I might add it just as I did here, worked with the pink. So, but my two basic colors are going to be burgundy, the main color of the jacket, and slate. But if you don't have slate, which is a little bit closer to aubergine, you can use cool gray 5. You can use just some dark gray instead of slate if you don't have it. And burgundy is just some dark red, right? So in this case, when I still have some lighter tone as a base, here we're going to have a zipper, and here we have this sort of belt. And so for the velvet, you have the base color, burgundy, and then you use a darker tone of the same color, but with the burgundy, there is no option of something even darker as a red. I mean, for me, I don't have such marker, so I'm using slate. But you can use cool gray 5. You can use just gray that suits the color that you have. Like if you use some blue, you can use cool gray 5 maybe cool gray 4, ice gray 4, depending on what blue you have. So now I'm adding slate. Also important is to have a little bit wet surface. So now I'm using this cardinal red, not because I need this color, but I don't want to add burgundy because burgundy is dark. If I add it more just to wet the surface, it will make the layer darker. That's how marker works. When you layer on top, like one layer, two, it gets darker. So that's why I just use some red that is close to burgundy but lighter. I wet the surface like here. I just add it just to make the surface wet. And then I add slate for the shadows. And because the surface is wet, slate blends a little bit. And it's applied softly. A lot of words, I hope you didn't get confused, but velvet is such a soft texture. It's really important that your shadows don't lay like special shapes like triangles, separate lines. They should blend well with the base color. So for that we need wet surface. So as your layers dry, you can still add slate inside the area that you just colored, like added the shadows. Now I take baby pink, I mix it with burgundy, and as we worked with leather, I try to blur those borders between pink and red. So I'm thinning that area that I left. And yeah, so if it's too complex for you, you feel like too many steps, you can move the video to the part where we're working with your right side. And there I'm using much easier way of coloring. And you can do it, and it will look very well as well. If you remember from Instagram, the final result just doesn't look different. Like two sides don't look that different. But here I just started working with 3 markers, so I just try to finish it that way. So okay, once when you dip your marker into the dark one, like I'm doing now, baby pink, I mix it with burgundy on the palette, clean it on some clean paper afterwards, and your marker will be fine. So in order not to spoil it or make it dirty. So on top of the pink, I'm adding burgundy. I'm doing it faster, so I did it while pink was still wet. And while burgundy is still wet, I'm adding slate. Shadows under the color. And here, along the edge. Okay, so now I'm mixing baby pink with burgundy again, adding some spots. Again, as I told you, the fabric is not super flat, and velvet tends to crease a lot, like the surface, you know, it's not flat because it's soft, right? So you can add many spots. Like now, I mix burgundy a little bit with black because I have black on my palette, and adding some spots around the shadows, just in the red area. It's very similar, like working with the paint. Now I'm using black pencil and just darkening certain parts. Especially like on the collar and the lapel, we need some darker shadows. And we have this double line. One is along the edge of lapel, and the other one is a thread line. And I'm drawing this button and going to color, like fill half of it with white ink pen, so to show the highlights. And here as well we have double line, the outline of the color and the thread line, and we have the button too. And here I draw many dashes, like tiny thin dashes, to show the zipper. And please watch in the full screen mode so you see all the details. And again, as I always recommend, I uploaded the reference image, and please take a look at it. I also uploaded the tip to Patreon on how to draw this sort of jacket, like oversized jacket, because it's important that you start drawing from the bodice first and then attach sleeves. Here we have like double thread line as well. Yeah, take a look at the reference image so to understand how I'm translating the texture to the sketch, so you better understand the principle. Okay, so here I'm adding baby pink, and while it's still wet I'm adding burgundy. We have this diagonal fold that is very common for the garments with the sleeves, like t-shirts and shirts. So, and we have some folds at the bottom. I'm leaving the top of the fold lighter, so I'm just keeping the pink. And slate. So I'm adding slate. And just wetting again the surface. For that I'm using cardinal red, just as I told you before, just because it's close to burgundy but lighter. And adding slate. So now it blends really well. It's not that sharp, the shape that I'm drawing. And more of burgundy. I can work on the borders of these slate shapes just to blend it even more. More of the slate. But you can see I'm still keeping the highlights like lit. And now time for white pencil. Mostly I work on the parts like that are left lit, just next to the shadows, right? And sometimes I have to erase to keep the highlights like a bit softer. And black pencil to make some shadows deeper. Okay, so I want to darken actually those highlights, because if they are too strong it might resemble like leather instead of velvet. And pencil is essential for velvet because it gives noise that is more like that is more velvet. Adding more shadows. And those places where we add shadows with cool gray 5 before I'm adding more with pencil. Okay, on the top I want to make stronger highlights. Okay, so second way of doing it, easier way, is when we just work with burgundy and slate. So my base layer is burgundy, while still wet I'm adding slate. Also color, now lapel. For the larger area, try to use wider nib of the marker, because it's just you'll color it faster and you'll have enough time to work with the next marker. So while it's still wet, and in the beginning it might be not convenient and comfortable to work with it, but you'll get used to it and you'll start turning it around, changing the angle, and you'll better control it, so you just need to practice more. So I'm just showing some folds that are stretching from your shoulder. You can see that we have at the shoulder the tension point, so all those folds are stretching from the shoulder. You can see it. So extra layer with the same slate. As I told you before, if you don't have this marker, you can use like some cool gray 5, or if you use like not burgundy but warmer red, you might use warm gray 5. Just try to match, to find the best match. So now I'm using burgundy and adding some spots. As I told you before, we have this pile on the velvet, and it can just, you know, be brushed in different directions, certain spots, and they will get different lighting. So even if your area is lit, there you might get some a bit darker spots because the pile there has facing different direction. So next steps are very similar to what we did on the left side. I'm adding shadows with a black pencil, making certain parts darker. Here we are going to have some details like pocket that also has this thread line, so we have double line. And buttons as well. And we have a button here on the pocket. And what makes easier this method is that we're not leaving highlights in pink. We're adding them with white pencil. So now I'm going to add all the strong highlights on this side. Also, it's nice to have a good set of some oil pencils where you have super light green, light pink. You can use them as well, like instead of using white, we could use like really oily, thick, light pink. But my pink is not laying that, it's not that light, so that's why I prefer using white pencil. So we have the second side of the zipper, many dashes, and I'm adding line on both sides just so we have show the base of the zipper. And more shadows. Okay, so just adding here and there burgundy. As I always say, I just break this process into steps for you. Cool Gray 5. You can see, like, instead of slate, I'm using Cool Gray 5. The result is very similar. But so slate, Cool Gray 5, they are all okay. So as I told you before, I'm breaking the steps into something that is describable, where I say do this and do this. But actually, like as an artist, you might know, like it's very also spontaneous process where you just add here and there. You feel like you need to add some hues reflected on the surface, or you feel like adding more shadows or highlights. So you feel free to make changes, to do something that you feel like right for you. Okay, more of highlights. In between, adding some red, more of shadows. The shadows under the belt part. Okay, so now adding eyelets on her belt. and just outlining the belt with a white pencil. Okay. Details of the zipper, and now using warm gray too. Warm gray because we have red jacket, like warm, and warm like color. That's why warm gray too. And warm gray too is just dark in certain parts. It really it doesn't, you know, darken that much the jacket. So, but it adds more contrast. So I just feel like certain parts are too bright. So I want just to add more of darkness. Okay, so finishing the jacket. Same way, like first burgundy, then slate. Below you can add just slate. And on the top we add highlights. For your skirt, I'm using ivory as a base. So here we are having like a more crushed velvet. So it will have certain texture of like many spots. And I'm using saffron. I'm going to use several similar markers, but you know, when all these pile faces different directions, you get these spots. And I'm actually just scribbling again. I like scribbling, but actually it really works for many textures. Please watch in full screen mode to see more or less the shapes. And I just feel like because her legs are stretched a little bit apart from each other, like I just make some like big spots that I don't color, like sort of a fault, like some tension between her legs. And you can see that between them I'm adding more of those spots. And on the sides, next I'm using khaki, just to show the beginning of those folds on the sides where they are. There is some gathering of the fabric, but you can use like warm gray 3, something. It's not necessary to use khaki. So now I'm working with warm gray 2, and I'm adding more of those spots. And using warm gray 2, again, because skirt is yellowish, so it's a warm color. And that's why I'm using warm gray, not cool, not ice gray. And I work both with warm gray 1 and warm gray 2. Warm gray 2 is more to show some spots with darker textures and to show the folds. And warm gray 1 to show some lighter spots all around the skirt. Yeah, like if you use like some green, try to use a little bit similar tones, but different greens. Different, maybe a little bit warmer color. But it depends again, like on the fabric of your choice. And then you pick gray, like depending on the warmth of the hue that you have. And just play around. So now again I'm using black pencil just to show some faults, to show this side deeper faults with all those shadows. And the last step is going to be adding correction pen. This is correction pen that you use in the office to hide the mistakes when you write. And yeah, I'm also scribbling. And I'm scribbling mostly in the area with the highlights, the light part, just around all those darker spots. And yeah, and that's how you get this result, this crushed velvet. I hope you follow me and feeling what I mean, because for me it's a bit difficult to express what I'm doing verbally sometimes. So now again, you can use beige, khaki, warm gray, 2, 3, and try not to use super dark ones, because if you can just risk making this skirt darker than it is, because it's a little bit sort of golden, shiny velvet. And actually, more you draw, more you experiment, more you come up with ideas how to express certain textures. So besides just watching the tutorials and repeating, try to find similar textures and just practice, play, have fun. Just have fun, really. Don't get stressed over drawing. It's the worst thing that you can do. Drawing is fun. So 10. I used 10, sorry if it's too fast, but it's a really huge tutorial. I used 10 as a base, and now I'm using warm gray 2 to show the shadows. On the sides, you can see where the leg is, the foot is bent, we have some shadows, and on the sides. Just like many mountains, just a range of mountains maybe on the sides. And then I'm using warm gray 3, and repeating. Maybe you could skip part with warm gray 2. I just found it to be too light, so that's why I'm using warm gray 3. And you can see more or less the shapes of all those side shadows. They really look like mountains, but a bit located vertically, like mountain range. And next, I'm using brown fine liner, and I'm drawing sort of these diamond shapes, but they're not perfect. They are all like distorted, and sometimes they are disconnected, and it's really important to draw them in this way. And you can see that I'm drawing them with these vertical lines, like many. I uploaded to Patreon again before this tutorial an exercise and explanation of how to draw this snake pattern. So you can just follow me right now. You can stop and take a look at the tips. And just once you remember the principle, then you'll be an expert at drawing this snake texture. So after you finish drawing the main pattern, add tiny spots and lines along those diamonds, like thinner shapes. Okay. So now I'm adding just the same shadows that I added before with warm gray, and adding more shadows with a brown pencil, because very often when you add all the patterns, you can see if the shape looks flat or it looks more dimensional. So now it looked flat, so I'm adding more shadows, increasing the contrast adding shadows in the same spots where we had. Okay, so now adding diagonal strokes in the area on the sides of these diamond shapes. So all that area on the sides, adding diagonal strokes with just simple pencil, and then adding some tiny highlights, like dots, because snake usually it's shiny, it's not matte, so it's very common for reptile leather. So I finished the second boot in the same way, and now I want to show you how I rendered this scarf. So it looks like more of artificial fur rather than feather, but this rendering might work even with the feather, I believe. So now, first I used mint as a base, and now using green. Green in Pro Markers is close to mint. So I color the base, and then I add this sort of strokes that you can see, because it's, I don't know how to describe this. So I make many strokes with some area between them. I can still see some mint that is at the base between those strokes. So now again, mint. Next I take green and add this many strokes. On the edges you can still add some strokes to show the pieces of hair. So just try to repeat it. Look at the direction of the strokes. They are more or less, because of the gravity, tend to look down, but sometimes they still have different direction, but moderately. A little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. Next, I'm using marine. Again, it's similar hue, darker tone, because just, you know, in this case, you need some contrast again. So I'm using really... next, I'm using Ice Gray 4. And applying similar strokes, maybe just a bit shorter, because in this case it's more about like shadows between, not exactly extra feather or hair. And next, I'm using pencil. And first of all, I'm adding this hair along the edges of the shape to show that the hair pieces, because pencil is much thinner than marker. And then I add extra like tiny, a bit curvy shapes on the top. But I'm not coloring everything with this pencil. I'm not covering with too many hair, because now I need some space to add these black spots with some shadows. And also I will need some spots to add highlights with white pencil afterwards. If you color everything with pencil, especially if you have wax pencil, it will be impossible to cover, like to use white pencil or black pencil on the top of it, because wax pencils don't layer like Prismacolor one. So the last step is adding this white pencil for the highlights, and this wonderful boa will be ready. So here you'll finish the bottom part yourself. I just want to show you the overall shape of the scarf. And when you render this hair pieces, pay attention to the direction of the scarf. It should be the same. So now black curly hair. First, just color the shape that you want to have, and then add pieces of hair with a black pencil, like curls all around and on the top as well, because as I mentioned before, black pencil sometimes is more opaque and darker than black marker, and if you don't color on the top, this extra hair that you added along the outline will be too dark and just look separate. So I added some strokes on the black part. You can see now when I zoomed, we can add even more. Here I'm missing some strokes. And then with a silver pencil, you can use white if you don't have a silver one. I'm adding highlights, and all in different directions. You can open curly hair and just take a look how the highlights look on the curls and just try to repeat. So yeah, and then add some shadows along the lower edge of the hair with warm gray 2 or 3. And we are done with this sketch. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial and learned something new for yourself. Thank you for being my patron. See you in the next tutorial.